Okay, wonderful. So yes, as Beth said, I'm speaking to you today as in my role as academic lead of the CAMS Digital Lab at King's College London. We do all sorts of research around informatics and tech in child and adolescent mental health, and I'm also a lecturer at UCL. But today I'm mainly going to be talking about work that I did as part of a fellowship with Administrative Data Research UK based on education and justice data. So this was a little bit of a step outside of the mental health realm for me, but a very interesting and compelling data resource that I'm going to be talking to you about. So for those that aren't familiar with this particular data resource, I'm just going to start off by introducing that. So this is a large national linkage that I used between justice data from the Ministry of Justice and education data from the Department for Education. So this data linkage was a huge undertaking by a group called Data First, and it essentially brought together information from the justice sector, including the Police National Computer, with information from the education sector, primarily comprising the National Pupil Database. And as a result of that linkage, as you can imagine, we have a really rich resource at our fingertips. With information on offences, court appearances, prison populations from the justice side, and information on attainment, absence, exclusion, socio-demographics, social care, and so on from the education side. So we really get to start conducting important and compelling cross-sectional research using this resource. As I say, it was a huge undertaking, this linkage. And the linkage which I used brought together education data with individuals who had at least one record on the Police National Computer from 2000 to 2017, and who were born on or after the 31st of August 1985. And this was England-wide. As I say, this is the iteration of the linkage that I used. The linkage has since been refreshed, so some of these dates and numbers will be even bigger now, which is just amazing. So researchers like me can request to access this linked data, and they can also request access to the wider National Pupil Database for other pupils in England who don't appear in the Police National Computer. And that's a really important component for our research, because it essentially means we can compare who we might think of as offenders or cases as compared to non-offenders or controls, just to put it very broadly. So that's the resource that this fellowship I did was drawing on. And of this linkage and the wider NPD, I requested access to individuals born between 1990 and 1997, which was a huge cohort of about 4.3 million pupils. And I do just want to dwell on that number briefly, because that's an incredibly impressive number when we're thinking about this kind of epidemiological research. Historically, Scandinavian countries have really led the way in terms of population data linkages. But with numbers like this, we're really hot on their heels. You know, this is vast. Issues like statistical power go out the window. P-values also kind of go out the window, because when you have data, more and more data you have, your p-values get smaller and smaller, and start to become a little bit meaningless. And instead, you start to worry about things like having enough computational power to process your models, which is definitely an issue that we encountered when doing this research. So that's the cohort I was working with. And I'm going to be talking about one particular study I did using this cohort, which was on associations between changes in school performance throughout the school career and involvement in the criminal justice system. So the purpose of this research was to really understand whether trajectories of someone's education attainment on statutory exams was a sensitive signal for whether or not someone would concurrently or later on in life become involved in the criminal justice system through cautions or convictions as recorded in the Police National Computer. So just to take this one step at a time, I'm going to start with the issue of modelling trajectories or changes in school performance throughout the school career, because this was sort of the first part of the project that we focused on. And just to orientate you to that, if you didn't grow up in the English school system, statutory testing in English schools take place at really 3 key time points. So Key Stage 1, Key Stage 2 and Key Stage 4. You'll notice Key Stage 3 is missing. That became non-statutory, those exams, quite some time ago. So we focus on attainment on statutory exams in Year 2, Year 6 and Year 11, which take place roughly when children are aged 7, 11 and 16 respectively. And we often refer to these as our primary school SATs in Year 2 and Year 6, or GCSEs and GNVQs in Year 11. Key Stage 1 has also become non-statutory now, I believe, so we'll need to think about how that's going to impact future analyses of trajectories of school performance. But for the cohort that I was using, that Year 2 data was very much there. So these are the key time points that I focused on for my analysis. And what we found through a process called growth mixture modelling is that pupils in my cohort of 4.3 million could generally be described as following one of 5 possible school performance trajectories. So I'm just going to take a moment to orientate you to this graph here, because this is key to understanding the subsequent findings that I go on to talk about. So on the x-axis across the bottom, you can see we have those 3 key time points, Year 2, 6 and 11. So these are our statutory testing time points. On the y-axis, we have what I've called an attainment Z-score. And what this means is that at each of those time points, what I've done is I've standardized school performance or attainment so that a score of 0 indicates average performance at that time point. So for an average pupil in England in our cohort performing at an average level throughout their school career, you would expect to see a trajectory like this black dashed line here. This is the reference line that you should pay attention to. So this indicates what average performance would look like throughout school. Now, as I say, pupils could generally be described as following one of 5 possible trajectories, which we can interpret in relation to that reference line. So the vast majority of pupils followed this a trajectory that looked rather like this red one here. So this indicates average or slightly above average school performance throughout school. We then have a series of somewhat smaller trajectories, which other pupils can fall into. So we have those in this purple trajectory who start off in Year 2 performing at about average levels, but by Year 11, they're performing well above average. So we can think of them as sort of uber high performers, as it were. We also have pupils in this green trajectory who start off performing at roughly average levels, but by the end of school, they're performing well below the average of their cohort. And then finally, we have these orange and blue trajectories here, where pupils start off performing well below the average of their cohort in Year 2, but by the end of school, they've either caught up to the rest of their cohort, as is the case for the orange trajectory, or they're still performing well below average, as is the case for the blue trajectory. So hopefully that makes sense. We've essentially tried to summarise all the pupils in our cohort as following roughly one of these trajectories. And inevitably, you know, this is a slightly broad brush way of doing it. People will follow different trajectories depending on what's going on in their lives. But this is kind of a rough summary that we can produce of everyone. Just to give you an idea of what the pupils in these different trajectories tend to look like, this slide, it's very busy, so apologies for that, but this just summarises the socio-demographic characteristics of the pupils in each of those trajectories. Now, I'm not going to go through every single number on this slide, but what I will point out is that the 2 columns on the left, average consistent, average increasing, these are the trajectories where pupils are typically staying above the average level throughout their school career. Whereas the three columns on the right, average declining, low increasing, low consistent, these are trajectories where pupils are at some point dipping below the average level in their school career. And what you can see is that in these lower performing trajectories, there is a higher frequency of males. You also see more pupils who are eligible for free school meals, which is a proxy for lower socioeconomic status. We see more looked after children, and we also, unsurprisingly, see more children with special educational needs. The story around ethnicity is a lot more mixed, so there's not really one clear-cut message that we can give in relation to that. But hopefully that just gives you an idea of the sorts of pupils we see following these different school performance trajectories over time. Now, as I mentioned, the thing that I was particularly interested in for this research was how these trajectories are associated with criminal offending. So this is where we bring the police national computer data in to this project. So this slide is showing the proportion of pupils in each of those trajectories who received a first conviction or caution for a criminal offence before the end of year 11. And hopefully your eye is immediately drawn to the green trajectory, those pupils who show a decline overall in their school performance throughout their school career. 1 in 3 of these pupils are convicted or cautioned for an offence sometime before the end of school. 1 in 3. So that's massive. This declining trajectory is obviously a reasonably sensitive signal for potential offending that might be happening in that time period. We were also interested in the proportion who went on to receive a first conviction or caution after school. So we were interested to see whether these trajectories could have any kind of predictive power for who might go on to be involved in the criminal justice system. And that's what this slide is summarising. So these percentages now show the proportion in each trajectory who went on to be convicted for a first offence after year 11 and up to the age of 21. So during young adulthood, essentially. And once again, your eye is probably drawn to the green trajectory, those pupils who generally show a decline in their attainment over the school career. 1 in 10 in that trajectory go on to be convicted or cautioned for a criminal offence during young adulthood, followed very closely by the blue trajectory, those who show consistently below average performance throughout school. Just to note a couple of other things, one thing that we found is that a similar pattern to this emerged for all sorts of different offence types. So one of the offence types that was perhaps not quite so clearly differentiated by changes in school performance was summary motoring offences. So in that group, there wasn't a huge amount of differentiation between the school performance trajectories. But apart from that, a similar pattern very much emerged, where it was the declining or consistently low trajectories that presented the highest risk for different types of offences. And just to highlight that point, this slide is showing specifically the proportion who went on to receive a first conviction or caution, where that was for a serious violence offence during young adulthood. So once again, you can see that it's the declining and the consistently low trajectories that present the highest risk for going on to be convicted or cautioned for this type of offence. Another thing that we started to dig into a little bit was the issue of repeat offending. So this table is showing in each trajectory of the individuals in each trajectory who went on to be convicted or cautioned for an offence. This is breaking it down by the number of offending days that the individuals had in that period. So we can think of this as sort of a proxy for repeat offending. And once again, what we can see is that those in the average to declining trajectory essentially were convicted or cautioned on the most number of days. So there seemed to be a higher level of repeat offending amongst those in a declining trajectory, and then also in the consistently low trajectory as well. Now, I've primarily presented descriptive statistics, but I do also just want to briefly note that we did do regression modelling where we adjusted for various other socio-demographic characteristics in these associations, just to see whether ethnicity, deprivation, SEND provision, social care, and gender explained these associations between school performance changes and offence convictions or cautions. And we found that adjusting for these factors did not make these associations go away. Inevitably, the strength of the associations were a little bit attenuated, but nonetheless, the associations that I've presented were still very much there and all going in the same direction. So what can we learn from this? Essentially, what I'm showing is that declining school performance throughout the school career appears to be most strongly associated with increased risk for later offending, and can also be an indicator of concurrent offending as well. And so I guess what the real policy message I'm trying to get across here is that we're potentially missing a really good opportunity to be drawing on changes in school performance as a signal that issues are going on in a pupil's lives and that we need to check in with them and offer some kind of support. Now, I'm not necessarily posing any kind of causal assumptions here that lower educational attainment leads to criminal offending. I'm just saying that school performance is a readily available signal. Pretty much all schools regularly assess their pupils at regular intervals. And so we really could be leveraging that information to pick up on pupils who are potentially struggling with something and need a bit of a check-in with some kind of support offered to them. Because they could be struggling with all kinds of things. It could be with their family, with housing, it could be with their peer group. Perhaps there's gang involvement, perhaps there's involvement in the care system, and so on and so forth. And in fact, another issue that might be going on with some of these individuals is issues with their health or their mental health. And I am going to touch on that briefly because this is a little bit of a step outside of the work I was doing for this specific fellowship. But I did mention that I am primarily a mental health researcher. I work with the CAMS Digital Lab in King's College London. And so I think it's worth mentioning that as part of research that I had conducted prior to this fellowship, and this was for my PhD, I was looking at the role of mental health in these school performance trajectories. And so in that research, what I was doing is I was leveraging another linkage we have in South London between education data and child and adolescent mental health records. And what we found in that research is that declining attainment was also associated with mental health difficulties. So once again, just to orientate you to this graph here, you can see we've kind of got the same metrics on both axes. So across the bottom, we have year 2, 6 and 11. These are our statutory time points, testing time points again. And on the y-axis, we have attainment Z-score. So once again, in this graph, attainment has been standardized so that for an average pupil in South London performing at an average level throughout school, we would expect to see a trajectory centered on 0 at all 3 time points. These trajectories I'm presenting here are just for adolescents in our catchment area who received a diagnosis of depression sometime before the age of 18. And what you can see is that among this group, in primary school, they're performing at average or, if anything, sometimes slightly above average levels. And it's only in year 11 that we see quite a marked drop-off in their school performance relative to their cohort, so that they're performing below average levels before the end of school. So I show you that really just to illustrate the point that, again, school performance trajectories can act as quite a powerful signal of a lot of other things that might be going on in a pupil's life. And again, just to illustrate that we could potentially be leveraging that information more effectively to signal when it's time to check in with pupils and see what sort of support they might need, be it with their mental health or with any other number of issues that they might be encountering. Now, I've kind of whistled through the research and findings a little bit, and I have done that for a reason. It's because, as Beth mentioned as part of the introduction, the reason why I'm actually here and I was invited to do this talk is because this project received a commendation for communication at the ONS Research Excellence Awards last year. So I actually just wanted to spend the rest of the talk dwelling a little bit on how we communicated these findings to different audiences, just in recognition of that being the reason that I'm here. So what I'm going to do now is I'm just going to illustrate to you some of the things that we did in order to create compelling communications for a range of audiences around this research. Some of them were quite simple, some of them were a lot more involved and complicated, but I guess I'm showing you this in the hopes that it might serve as some inspiration for the sorts of things that you might choose to do for your research. So the first and perhaps the most straightforward thing we did is we commissioned illustrations for our report. Now, this sounds really kind of straightforward on the face of it, but it's not always something that people think to do. For my fellowship, I had to produce a final report for Administrative Data Research UK that summarised the background and the methods and the findings of the fellowship. And what I decided to do is commission someone to create illustrations for this report, just to make it a little bit more compelling for other researchers and also for policymakers who might be reading the report. So these illustrations were created with the lead designer for the CAMS Digital Lab. And you've seen these illustrations peppered throughout this presentation because I still continue to use them. They're really lovely little drawings. So if you're producing a final report, I would encourage you to think about whether this is something you could also do just to make it that little bit more engaging. The other thing I did was I commissioned an easy read version of the final report. Now, for those of you that aren't familiar with this term, easy read is essentially a version of any document which has been produced for those with learning difficulties or reading difficulties and keeping their needs in mind. So often these are quite simplified versions of the reports in terms of language, and they're often accompanied by different images and illustrations just to help those with those additional needs navigate the report. And it just makes sure that the findings we're producing are really accessible to everybody, not just to other researchers who understand all the kind of complexities of language that we use, but everyone can then access this information equally. So my Easy Read was created with this company called easyreadonline.co.uk. I wholeheartedly recommend them. They were very good. And this is just a couple of pages from the Easy Read version of the report, just to give you an idea of what that can look like. As you can see on the left here, it gives readers a lot of signposting around what different terms mean. So they gave an explanation of what the criminal justice system is. And you can also see there are lots of images peppered throughout just to help people navigate the information and to supplement some of the language that's being used in the text. Another thing we did is we produced a video summarising administrative data and our findings from this research. And we did that particularly with younger audiences in mind. Now, I want to contextualise why we did this a little bit further. So as I say, I do a lot of research around young people, particularly in the mental health space. And as part of that, I do a fair bit of advisory group consultation with young people. Now, often I find when I'm doing this sort of advisory group work, that people are surprised to learn that their data that's been collected by the National Pupil Database or through health services is being used for research. It's something that's not publicised as well as it could be. And I think it's something that all of us who use this kind of data are still working on, how we can communicate the fact that this is happening to people whose data we are using. So I was particularly interested in how we could do this in a palatable way for adolescents and young adults. And that's simply because this is an age group that education data is being collected for right now because they're in school, they're in college. And I think it's good to get in early and explain to them how their data is going to be used while the data is still being collected. So I'm just going to show you the animation that we produced. This was created by Really Bright Media, and that's on the next slide. So I'll shut up for a few minutes and we can watch the video together.
ADR UK is using administrative data to inform research that can help our society. But first, what is administrative data? Administrative data is information collected about everyone when we interact with public services. For example, from the moment you enrolled at school, administrative data has been securely collected about your educational journey using school records. Here's the exciting part. This data can be used for research to shape a better future for everyone. For example, by informing policy that helps young people in school. We can get even more insights if data on one service, like education data from schools, is linked to another, like crime data from law enforcement. Some research linking education and crime data has shown that young people who struggle academically throughout school or who show declines in their school performance are more likely to face challenges in adulthood, like getting involved in crime. So, it's important to identify how we can better support young people who are struggling in school, whether it's with their education, mental health, or home life. Without linked administrative data, this research wouldn't have been possible. You're probably wondering how your privacy is protected when the data is being used. Lizzie can show you. Lizzie and everyone involved in using administrative data for research must ensure your privacy is protected. This is done by following a set of principles called the 5 Safes framework: safe data, safe projects, safe people, safe settings, and safe outputs. Information about your identity is completely removed from data before it is shared with researchers like Lizzie. You can explore more about administrative data research and its potential to improve our lives. Visit ADR UK and get involved. We can build a brighter future together. ADR UK is using...
There we go. So that's the video. Hopefully you enjoyed that. Just to give a little bit more background to this video as well. It's quite a short video, but a lot of work goes into producing this kind of output. And I just wanted to dwell on that point a little bit, because one of the most recent outputs that I've produced as following on from this fellowship is a learning resource on the ADR UK website that just elaborates a little bit on the process of what goes into creating this sort of animated video. And I'm just going to give that a brief outline now, just in case that's of interest to anyone here who might be thinking of producing this sort of output. So as I say, it was actually quite a lengthy process that involved a lot of consultation, and delivering the video really took place in 3 phases. So the first phase we kind of badged as this discovery phase, where we did some advisory group consultation to scope the appetite for having this kind of video and to get tips from young people about what sort of thing they would hope to see in this sort of video. I also did a little review of animated videos that already exist in this field to basically, identify features that we might want to adopt in our own video or things we might want to avoid. We identified a production company, which, as I say, was Really Bright Media. We developed a script and storyboard. That was a very iterative process going back and forth between us and data owners and ADR UK. And we also built in some professional consultation as well. So an early version of the animated storyboard was shown at the ADR UK conference to get feedback from other researchers who use these kind of data in terms of, what could be improved in the video and what was working well. Once we'd done all that, we moved on to the delivery phase. So Really Bright Media produced the final version of the video, recording voiceovers, animations, etc. And crucially, they also produced the video in different formats for social media platforms. And that then formed part of our dissemination strategy, which was phase 3. And this was also quite a lengthy process, because we planned dissemination in collaboration with comms teams, both at ADR UK and at King's College London. And we developed a multi-pronged strategy for getting this video out there through YouTube, web pages. We did a blog post, and then we used various social media platforms as well. And the eagle-eyed amongst you will note that TikTok is not on that list of social media platforms. That's just because none of us at the time had a professional TikTok account on the go that we could post it on. But it's something that the lab I work in is actually starting to build up a profile for now. So hopefully this video can still end up on TikTok, because that's really where our target audience is. The last thing I'm going to say just on the communication front is also just to plug the idea of sharing our code. If there are any researchers on the call, this is potentially something you're already doing, but I just wanted to give it a little bit of a shout out, because I do think it's part of communications for any research project. It's just communicating with other researchers. So there's a link to my GitHub there. And you can find on there some code for doing different things like modelling school performance trajectories in M+, which is the software I used for some of this research, and also some code for deriving socio-demographic variables for different time points in data. So this is just referring to the fact that the National Pupil Database contains socio-demographic information for lots of successive censuses. And so I've written some code which can iterate backwards through those censuses to find the most recently available data for each individual, and more. So do go and have a look at that if you're interested in replicating any of the research that I've done or using similar methods. That's it. I'm going to stop there. Thank you very much for listening. I hope it was of interest, and